We're joined now by two guests. Dan Yakir is chief legal counsel for the Association for Civil Rights in Israel. His organization has led the effort in Israel to uncover information about prisoner X. The Israeli Supreme Court has just today lifted a gag order on the group's role in the case. And we're joined by Antony Loewenstein, who is joining us from Sydney, Australia, via Democracy Now! Video stream, an independent journalist and author, co-founder of Independent Australian Jewish Voices. Antony, let's begin with you. If you could start off by just laying out what this case is all about, who this man was.
In short, this gentleman's identity was not known, as you said, until last week. We knew a little bit about the case a few years ago when the Israeli press reported that a gentleman had committed suicide in an Israeli prison. We knew nothing else. Fast forward till last week, and the Foreign Correspondent program on local television broke the story, and it's gone global since. What essentially has come out in the last week has been a litany of information which really goes to the heart, I think, of what regularly happens between Australia and Israel. On the one hand, what happens to this gentleman, Ben Zygier, is unique. Not that many Australians die in Israeli prisons, either murdered or suicide. That's true. But on the other hand, the facilitation by the Australian Jewish establishment and the Australian intelligence services of young Jews to Israel to live there, to obviously serve in the IDF and sometimes work for Mossad is not that unusual. It doesn't get talked about. The press doesn't really examine it very often, but it's not that unusual. And it goes to the heart in some ways of what the Jewish Zionist lobby here is about in Australia and indeed in many Western countries, including in your country, the US, which is to facilitate and blindly support Israeli security.
Antony, we're gonna cut off you for 1 minute because Dan Yakir has just joined us, and because this Israeli Supreme Court decision has just come down, we don't want to lose him as he goes off to other interviews. Dan Yakir is the chief legal counsel for the Association for Civil Rights in Israel. Dan, can you speak to us about what the Supreme Court has just decided and what information you are going to be releasing now?
Yeah, it's only in regard to the proceedings we initiated 2 years ago. ACRI heard for the first time about prisoner X in June 2010, 6 months before his death, and we addressed the Attorney General, raising our concern about the prisoner being totally isolated and under complete secrecy. A few days after we heard about his death in mid-December, we filed a motion with the district court to lift the gag order, or at least limit its sweeping scope to allow publication of some details about the charges brought against him, and especially the concern about how he was found dead in the most protected cell of the prison services. After the district court dismissed our motion, we filed an appeal with the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court heard the appeal on February 2 years ago. But the judges also were the judges on the Supreme Court had the security services for an hour and a half ex parte, and after that they told us they were convinced that the complete secrecy is justified.
Dan, if you could step back for a minute and go back and tell us how you learned about this case. You knew about this man, Ben Zygier, in jail before he died, before he, quote, committed suicide. Talk about how you knew about it, what alarms you started to raise, and then what happened after you learned he had, quote, committed suicide.
In May 2010, there was a short-lived report on an Israeli news site, Ynet, regarding a prisoner X held in the Ayalon prison, in complete isolation, and even the prison guards don't know his identity and are prohibited from talking to him. After a few hours, this report vanished, and it raised our concern regarding the rights of the prisoner and the conditions that he is held, both but also the complete secrecy around the affair. And we tried to gather some details about it, but couldn't, and that's why we addressed the Attorney General for the first time. 6 months later, we got information from a source connected to the media about his being found dead in his cell, and then we filed the motion with the court.
Dan Yakir, can you talk about what precedent there is, if any, for a gag order that was, we are to understand, exceptionally broad? Has there been a precedent for this before in Israel with any prisoner?
There were a few cases in the last couple of years. In all those cases, we either filed motions with the court or approached the Attorney General, but they were for a much limited period of time. In the case of Anat Kam, a soldier in the IDF who was charged and convicted of copying hundreds of classified documents, and other cases. In the past, there were a few exceptional cases where prisoners were held under false identity for years, and the most notable one is Dr. Marcus Klingberg, a biologist who was convicted of espionage on behalf of the USSR, and he was held during most of his years in prison under false identity, and his trial was under complete secrecy.
Dan, we want to come back to you. We want to play a brief clip of the ABC, that's Australian Broadcasting Corporation, TV documentary that exposed the identity of prisoner X. In this, a former Australian intelligence agent, Warren Reid, expresses skepticism about claims that Ben Zygier committed suicide.
There are lots of ways nowadays where you can pick up the extent to which the person in the cell is sweating, their heartbeat, or all sorts of things. I mean, modern technology applied in a cell like that almost totally precludes any possibility of someone like him, sanitised in that way, could hang themselves. I find it almost impossible to believe.
Warren Reid also indicated the nature of his imprisonment suggested that the case was very sensitive.
The degree of sanitisation of this gentleman, where he was put in Unit 15 in that prison, which was constructed only as one cell, and hermetically sealing him away in all human terms, even within the prison, from his society, his family. That suggests that it has to be something very, very touchy and very immediate. Otherwise, we wouldn't go to those lengths.
That is footage courtesy of ABC TV Australia's foreign correspondent program. If you could comment on this, Dan Yakir, and also on the allegations that that this man, that Ben Zygier, was involved with the assassination of Mahmoud al-Mabhouh, the Hamas official who was killed in Dubai in a hotel room that we all came to see on closed-circuit television.
I have no information in regard of the charges that were brought against him.
Repeat that.
I have no information in regard to the charges brought against him.
But in terms of what Warren Reid was saying, the Australian agent, to do with suicide. Yesterday,
magistrate court allowed to publish parts of the decision of the judge that investigated the circumstances of his death, and according to the finding of the judge, it was a suicide. Because according to the tapes, the video, the cameras, no one entered the cell. And I accept that, but another important finding of the investigative judge was that prison guards should be charged negligently causing his death. And we are waiting the decision of the state attorney, in regard of charges that will be brought against senior officials of the prison services.
In a moment, we're going to go back to Antony Loewenstein, who's in Australia. But the response, Dan Yakir, in Israel, how much support are you getting for exposing what has taken place, what you're beginning to understand and what you're revealing?
I hope that this whole affair will be a watershed. I think most of the public, unfortunately, rely on the security services and think that whatever they deem to be secret should be a secret. But I think the tragic results of this whole affair, I hope, will serve as a watershed of raising a positive suspicion against the security services that has either a conscious or unconscious interest to cover up mishappenings during their operation.
And how does this compare to treatment of Palestinian prisoners?
Usually Palestinian prisoners are not held under secret conditions or in isolation, but there was also the case of the engineer Abu Sisi from Gaza, who allegedly was kidnapped by the Mossad from a train in Kiev, and charges were brought against him of being involved in the rocket firing on Israel. And at first, the mere fact that he was arrested was under a gag order. After we filed a motion that this was lifted, but his whole trial is also conducted behind closed doors.
We want to thank you for being with us, Dan Yakir, Chief Legal Counsel for the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, as we turn back to Antony Loewenstein, who is the independent journalist and author following the Prisoner X story. The response in Australia, Antony, as you listen to Dan Yakir speaking from Israel.
Look, the response by the establishment Jewish community has essentially been virtual silence. When the story broke last week, they will have virtually every Jewish lobby group has said nothing, literally nothing, until yesterday there was a statement released by the leading Jewish organisation in Australia, which had a very kind of benign statement saying that we're encouraged by the fact that Israel and Australia will undergo a investigation, which I suspect will be a bit of a whitewash. The Australian government is embarrassed because the details of this case remain murky. One of the things that hasn't been mentioned is that during the Dubai hit on the Hamas operative in 2010, the Australian passports were used and forged for that mission, amongst other countries as well. And the Australian government publicly at the time was pretty upset about this, as other governments were as well. But in private, I've heard from a variety of sources that, in fact, the reality was that this sort of thing is known to happen. Many governments do it, including our own government, my government, the Australian government. So officially, the Australian and the Israelis would like this issue to disappear. And one of the things that's become very clear in Australia in the last week, and indeed this is reflected, I think, in the fact that the Australian Jewish establishment sees its role as endorsing and enforcing what Israel does, whether it's backing the occupation or supporting a strike on Iran. All those things fit into this narrative, which is young Jews who go to young Jewish schools in Australia. Australia is one of the most pro-Israel countries in the world, along with South Africa and, of course, obviously the US. That it's not that surprising this sort of thing has happened. The details are unique, but the facilitation of a gentleman like Ben Zygier to undergo these kind of actions by Mossad is not that unusual. It just doesn't usually get talked about in the press.
And what has been the significance of this case, you think, for Australia as this news has come out?
Well, I think one thing that it's done, and this has been discussed in the wider press, in the wider media, and indeed in many public forums in the last week, has been a lot of Australians are uncomfortable with the fact that an Australian citizen can go to Israel, become an Israeli citizen, join the IDF, undergo some kind of training and potentially work for Mossad and commit acts which, in any definition, are breaches of international law, whether it's the assassination of Hamas leaders in Dubai or involved in other strikes against Iranian nuclear scientists. So many people feel uncomfortable about this. And one of the things that we do see in Australia, and we see it in the US and many countries, is when Israel, for example, starts a war, whether it's against Lebanon or Gaza or elsewhere, you see a number of Australian Jewish dual nationals go to Israel to fight in the IDF with the Israeli military. And that sort of thing, I think, makes a lot of Australians uncomfortable, rightly so, in my view. And I think there needs to be a real question here. This is one of the things that's being talked about in circles, not so much publicly in the Australian Jewish community, but certainly privately and indeed in the wider press, that why does the Australian government feel comfortable facilitating young Jews to move to Israel and potentially commit acts of arguably, in certain cases, terrorism or at least breaches of international law in Gaza or Lebanon or Dubai, wherever Ben Zygier may have been behaving.
Anthony, isn't the Australian intelligence now investigating why it was that Ben Zygier came back to Australia and changed his name and his passport several different times?
Possibly, Amy, yes. But one of the things that also is involved in this story is that the Australian intelligence services knew what Ben Zygier was doing. One of the things that remains unclear is exactly why the Israelis arrested Ben Zygier and put him in high-security prison. Was it because he was leaking information to the Australian intelligence services? Was he about to break some story to the press? Was there a crisis of conscience? We don't know. These certainly are allegations that have been talked about here by a number of reliable sources and indeed in Israel as well. So, yes, the Australian intelligence services publicly are talking about an investigation, but just like in the US, they are incredibly opaque. There is not really any kind of legislative transparency in the way ASIO, which is the intelligence services here, operates. So as much as we like to think that there would be some kind of investigation which is released publicly, the sad reality is that both Australia and Israel would like the situation to remain as it is today. In other words, very, very close relationship.
I want to thank you very much, Antony Loewenstein, for joining us. Independent journalist and author, co-founder of Independent Australian Jewish Voices, has been closely following the Prisoner X story from Sydney. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute. Thanks so much for watching this report from Democracy Now!, your daily independent global news hour. We don't accept advertising or corporate funding, but rather rely on donations from viewers like you. Please make your contribution by visiting democracynow.org. We need your support today to keep bringing you this hard-hitting, in-depth reporting.